All right, so welcome everyone from wherever you're joining us in the world. So, my name is Brian, I'm the host of this program. So, this webinar today is part of an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek Programme hosted by the Research Institute Stickett at the London School of Economics. So, the aim of this webinar series is to explore a range of topics that are related in some way, direct or indirectly, to the intellectual contributions of the economist F.A. Hayek. These may include individualism and economic freedom, the nature of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision making under uncertainty, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and justice, and others. I encourage everyone to check out our future events or Eventbrite, which I will put in the chat later on, and also our past recordings of webinars done and uploaded on YouTube, which I'll also share in the chat later. So today we're very pleased to have with us Professor Geoffrey Hodgson as our speaker today. He's speaking on the topic Is Socialism Feasible? So Geoff is an emeritus professor in management at Loughborough University London. He's a specialist in institutional and evolutionary economics with a background in economics, philosophy, and mathematics. His research has applications to the understanding of organizations, organizational change, innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic development. So his talk today will actually cover two of his many books that he has published. The first being Is Socialism Feasible, published in 2019 by Edward Elgar, and the second being a more recently published autobiography titled From Marx to Markets: An Intellectual Odyssey, also published by Edward Elgar, which I'm sure Geoff will speak more about later. We will put this in the video description and in the chat later for your further exploration. So please note that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube over the coming week. So he'll be speaking for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A lasting approximately 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the type of questions that we get. So you may drop your questions over the course of the presentation in the Q&A function below. I will hold on to these questions and begin posing them to our speaker at the very end. So without further ado, I will now hand the time over to Geoff to start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for inviting me to this very interesting series of seminars. It's a pleasure to talk to you all today about this very important topic. Brian now was saying earlier that it's a shame that these kind of topics are not discussed more often, but nevertheless, here we go. Brian kindly asked me to relate to two works, my Is Socialism Feasible book, and also my recent intellectual autobiography, From Marx to Markets. In consultation with Brian, what I've decided to do is to basically cover the arguments, thinned down, boiled down, about the feasibility of socialism in the talk. And then towards the end, I'll give you a cue and mention the other book and give you some waypoints on my own intellectual evolution, because as this title suggests, a long time ago, I was a Marxist before about the early 80s, and more than 40 years ago, and I changed my mind, and you may be interested in why I changed my mind, who influenced me, and so on. But you can ask questions about that. Okay, so you've had time to look at the structure of the talk. I'm going to talk about the meaning of socialism, and I'm going to talk about big socialism, small socialism, and explain that. But let's go. It's remarkable that in the 1990s, this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a number of leading scholars declared socialism to be a dead issue. In some ways, it was, because the model in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc collapsed, and in China there were major changes in the 80s, early 80s onwards, which also departed from traditional socialism at least. But after the great crash of 2008, there's a remarkable resurgence of interest in socialist ideas. I'm quite interested in the idea that huge economic crises, particularly global economic crises, do have major effects on ideas. They did in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, a number of people veered to the left, became interested in the Soviet Union and so on. And that was true for a number of thinkers. And similar leftward movements occurred 2008 crash. It's the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with capitalism and we have to look for an alternative. And that's a reasonable question, but I think it's how you answer it is important. So, is socialism feasible? That's a central question. Well, basically, my answer is yes. Various people, including Hayek and von Mises and others, have been a little bit ambivalent about this. There's different statements with different degrees of emphasis. But I'm saying, but basically, yes, it is feasible, and that was demonstrated by the survival of countries like the Soviet Union for such a long time before they collapsed in 1989 or 1991. So the answer is yes, but what I do in the book is make a distinction between what I call small socialism and big socialism. Now, it's a rough distinction. What's important, I think, is face-to-face interaction and context. A lot of people we talk about these days, including the great Ellen Ostrom, talk about the role of face-to-face interaction and establishing norms through spontaneous interactive processes. And that can happen, in my view, on a small scale, and it does. We have many examples, including some from Ostrom's work, of that happening. So I make a distinction between communities of less than 1,000, where face-to-face contact is possible at some frequency, and trust relationships can be established. And larger, small socialism, we require markets to coordinate these smaller communities. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but in fact, a lot of socialists have always rejected markets. Marx and Owen, for particular reasons, Robert Owen I'm talking about here, ruled out markets and ruled out trade. They just simply rejected the idea. And is central to traditional Marxism, at least. The problem with big socialism is different. It's feasible in a way, not in a completely planned way, because, as Hayek pointed out, it's impossible to get all the knowledge together in one place and make rational decisions about everything at some central committee level, or any level for that matter. The problem with it is different. Basically, the problem is it's incompatible with democracy. We can give good reasons for that. And we can point to experience with socialism or experiments with socialism around the world for the last 120 years, which show that democracy doesn't survive this. So that's the basic conclusions. It's feasible, but not in terms that we would particularly welcome. Just to rehearse the basic definitions, for Robert Owen, this is from about the 1830s onwards, and from Marx slightly later, communism or socialism, as they put it, for both of them meant abolition of private property, the abolition of markets too, the abolition of trade. Perhaps it had to have some minimal existence in some early form of socialism, but eventually everything would be done in a different way. By the way, we don't need to draw much of a distinction here between socialism and communism. The difference, the reason why Marx and Engels adopted the term communism, hence as in Manifesto of the Communist Party, they didn't call it Manifesto of the Socialist Party, it's because they wanted to distance themselves from the Owenite utopian socialists and others like French utopian socialists who believed that by persuasion and reason, socialism could be established everywhere. Marx, on the contrary, emphasized class struggle and overthrowing what he called the bourgeois state and replacing it by a system where workers apparently would rule somehow. He had the same objective as Owen, which was to abolish private property. Many people don't acknowledge this similarity between the two of them, but it's there in the texts. And to illustrate that point, this is a pre-1995 copy of a Labour Party membership card. So it's if you're a Labour Party member before 1995, which I was for a while, on it you would see what's called Clause 4, and it says to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, etc. And that was on the Labour Party membership card from when it became a membership party in 1918 until Tony Blair changed it in 1995. He changed the wording here, but he kept the word socialism on Labour's aims without defining what he meant by that. And several people tried to change this. They said it was too wholesale. We should be supporting mixed economies. I agree with those arguments, but they failed. They failed to persuade the party, and the revising the meaning of socialism has not been accomplished. So the concise Oxford Economic Dictionary still defines socialism as the proposal that the community as a whole should own and control the means of production, distribution, and exchange. It's very important to emphasize this, because I go on social media and argue with people that call themselves socialists, and they don't know what socialism means, and they have to be reminded. And this is what it means, and we're not going to change its meaning. It's been with this meaning for almost 200 years, and the term was first introduced in 1827. And it's not going to change, and attempts to change it have not changed it. But social democracy is a different term, which originally meant the same thing as socialism, common ownership, so on. And it was used more frequently in continental Europe, used in a bit in Britain, but not so much. And the crucial point here was the Cold War and the reaction of the German Social Democratic Party, which is still a large party in Germany. It is Bad Godesberg Contrast in 1959. And they changed the meaning of social democracy fundamentally. It already had shifted, it already signaled a more moderate and compromising version, perhaps with a mixed economy. It's absolutely clear. The Social Democratic Party therefore favours a market wherever free competition really exists. We have markets as long as they're competitive. Where a market is dominated by individuals or groups, however, all manners of steps need to be taken to protect freedom in the economic sphere. As much competition as possible, as much planning as necessary. So I think we can accept this as a new standard meaning, which has become established, of social democracy. And social democracy is different from socialism. I'm happy to be called a social democrat for this reason. I would accept the wording in this crucial 1959 declaration. Okay, that's the introduction. Let's talk about small socialism. I mentioned Robert Owen, who was crucial, who started to develop what he called cooperative or eventually socialist communities from about 1825 onwards. This is one project which is in the USA. There was a few dozen experiments in the USA with Owenite socialist communities, and about a couple of dozen in Britain as well. This is a projection of what their new harmony commune was going to be like. It never actually was realized in that form, but it did exist, but it only lasted 2 years. And we must raise a question why. I'll discuss that later. Why did it only last 2 years? In fact, if you look more at them, so there's a great paper by Sosis in the year 2000 published, and looked at, so we're using a database of US-based, American-based communities with common ownership of both secular and religious nature, because some experiments with communitarian or communist or socialist communities in the United States were by religious groups like the Hutterites and the Amish. So with the sample is 112 secular and 88 religious. The secular ones would not just be Owenite, they would also include Furious, and some just collapsed very quickly. The mean, though, is very different. The secular, on average, lasted 6 years, and the religious, 25 years. So again, we should discuss why. If you break down the Owenite and Fourierist, which are both secular, and compare them with the Shaker communities, we get a very different set of means. The two secular examples, the Owenite and the Fourierist, 2 years and 3 years respectively. The Shaker, nearly 57 years. This is even more remarkable because the Shaker communities did not believe in procreation. They did not believe in men and women having children. That was for progressive arguments. So they gave a progressive argument. They argued that if you allow that to happen, if you allow procreation, then women are constantly burdened by childcare, and therefore the balance of rights and powers between the two sexes can change. And they wanted a more equal society, so they relied solely on recruitment rather than procreation. Most other communities allowed people to have children, but the Shakers did not, and they still managed to last amazing more than half a century. Right. The conclusion, back a bit, the reason for this is partly to do with the establishment of rule. How do you get rules established? And the religious model has systems of rules which are more difficult to challenge. I'm saying they're right or wrong, they're more difficult to challenge. And there's a way of stopping argument by some elder or priest or something standing up and saying, those are the rules. This is what God wanted us to do. We must follow that word. And so it's basically that problem of keeping these communities together, which accounts for the difference between the secular and religious examples. And there's more of that in Socialis's great article. So another example we've got is the Yugoslav republics, which is a very interesting example. And there they were not community based. They were actually, common ownership was based, in inverted commas, on worker cooperatives. So it's a model which contrasts with standard Soviet style socialism, because they broke up the structures to have worker cooperatives of a kind and much less central planning and centralization, much more devolved. And this contrasts with Soviet socialism, and also contrasts with the capitalist West because of the degree of cooperation. Now, we can argue the reasons are quite complex why these failed, and they're not just to do with the socialistic problems with socialism. It's also to do with the fact that Yugoslavia was a potentially volatile mix of different groups and nationalities. And Tito did a fantastic job, an amazing story about how Yugoslavia was kept together despite all these internal cultural and religious and ethnic differences. But these eventually exploded, and they exploded only after the economy began to fail. So the initial reasons may have well been due to the economic model. One of the problems with the economic model is it was nominally about social ownership, but in legal terms, it didn't mean anything at all, because there was still apparatchik control of these cooperatives by members of the party and so on. And workers at least perceived that they didn't have full rights of ownership. So it wasn't well-established common ownership. And there were even cases when the economic conditions began to deteriorate in the 80s of strikes, of workers striking against the managers in their own cooperative, which will be unheard of in a proper cooperative. So it was a failure to completely implement a market model with well-defined, localized common ownership rules, which were subject to laws rather than party officials, which I think partly accounts for the Yugoslav model. That's an interesting case, but we can talk more about that. It failed partly for those reasons. So my argument would be, if I had more time to talk about all the details here, but it's a big issue, is small socialism is viable, but only within a liberal order, in the fullest sense of that word, and liberal politically and liberal economic, with markets and an effective independent legal system. So if you're a worker cooperative, it's got to be able to go to the courts effectively and sue people if they think this thing's wrong, if there's defective products being supplied or some other reason. That, like just as in normal market economy, capitalist economy, corporations can sue other corporations or whatever, or the state or whatever, according to perceptions of what may be wrong. But that was not possible to any great degree in the Yugoslav model because it was a one-party state, and ultimately the power rested with the party until it blew up, of course. So one of the problems with the Yugoslav system was the lack of a democracy as well. So I would say yes, small socialism is possible. We need at least markets for it to work. For it to work well, you require a proper legal system, and that requires legal autonomy, rule of law, and that has to be governed by some form of democracy. Okay, let's move to big socialism. This is much larger scale, typically national scale, millions of people. The promise here with Lenin, this is words from his State and Revolution, which, as you know, was written just before the October Revolution, when Lenin was in hiding in a period of difficulty prior to the revolution itself. And he wrote this book, The State and Revolution, and it was sort of an optimistic vision of how wonderful things would be, or at least how positive many things would be. He realized the problems. He was not naive about the difficulties, but he believed it was still possible to have an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy of the people, and not democracy for the money bags. So there's a clue here that only the proletariat get a vote. And that's what they implemented, and then ended up nobody getting a vote. First of all, the Bolsheviks seized the power and closed down the Duma. Now, because they were in very difficult circumstances, they seized power in October 1917. They had the problem of negotiating a peace agreement with Germany because Russia was being bled by the war. And then, as subsequent to the war ending in 1918, they had a vicious civil war that started earlier. So they had years of civil war. Millions died. Very difficult circumstances. But for whatever reason, partly because of intention, partly because of external difficulties, the Bolsheviks seized power and closed down the parliament. There was no parliamentary democracy. There was then was meant to be Soviet power, worker councils. Notice just worker councils, not anybody else having a vote, not people running a home or looking after children, for example. By 1918, all other political parties were banned. Again, it was in severe circumstances, but I think it would have happened anyway, given the drive, the way Lenin was thinking. The one-party state nationalized much of the economy, introduced forced labor, and started building socialism or communism even. Now compare I've got friends who still say, well, look, we know Lenin, friends on the left who say, we know Lenin was bad and Stalin was worse and so on and so forth, but it was much worse under the Tsars. Okay, it was. I mean, there was a serfdom until the 1860s in Tsarist Russia. But look at these figures. In 80 years under Tsarism, from 1826 to 1905, executions averaged 17 a year. Then you have the 1905 rebellion, and 11,000 people were executed. Okay, we'll take both of those sets of figures into account. The Soviet secret police killed an average of 28,000 people a year from 1917 to 1922, many without judicial proceedings. Again, it was in a period of largely civil war, but this is much higher, even the highest figure for the Tsarist regime, highest annual figure for that. So this was a dictatorial regime. It was a ruthless, violent regime which suppressed all dissent. It's estimated that Stalin was responsible for about 15 million deaths. and much of this was due to famine. Now we have those are very sad times, and it's easy to look at that in hindsight. But in our living experience, we've seen the failed revolution in Venezuela, and while it doesn't meet the levels of disaster of Lenin or Stalin, it does show similar patterns of social evolution, if you like. So, briefly, the story here is Chavez, who was this charismatic left populist, strong socialist rhetoric, and so on, elected president in 1998, and to push through nationalization and many other things. He seized control of the courts and electoral authority, expressed much of the opposition of media. Criticism of the government was made legal. Now, it was still probably nominally, at least, a democracy when Chavez died a few years later from cancer. And the Venezuelan socialist regime has never entirely got rid of the private sector. The private sector is still there, very much hedged in by state controls, but it's still there. So the 100% nationalization the Bolsheviks achieved has not been replicated in Venezuela, but still, nevertheless, the impetus, the push, the desire to get this centralized planned system in place led Chavez and his successor Maduro to actually close down democratic checks and balances, seeing them as obstacles to his social revolution. He had referendums, but they were very much like referendums that Hitler used. There were devices to reinforce his own control. With one exception, he lost one referendum. So we have this very sad situation. We have demonstrations, and this poor guy here saying, "There's no, I don't have any food. There's no food." And 8 million refugees fleeing the country, going elsewhere in Latin America and other places because of the regime. And no one's saying it's in a wonderful state. And unlike Cuba, where there were and still are heavy US sanctions, Venezuela had mild sanctions and only on individuals. They managed to create the mess themselves, so we can't simply blame it on the Americans. Right, so the experience we have in every case, without exception, including China, is that these attempts to concentrate economic power, create some central planning authority, even with the wish to democratize it and devolve it and all the rest of it, have always led to huge concentrations of political as well as economic power. And as a result, the temptations for people who are very zealous about their particular mission of creating socialism has been the end of democracy. No exception to that at all. So this is the basic problem that I call the power problem. Concentration of political power comes from the concentration of economic power. This is the call that the power problem. It's also mentioned by Hayek as well, particularly in the road to serfdom. The second problem is one of several, is due to Albert Scheffler. And I give an example of this. What Scheffler argued was that with many people, again, he was conscious and aware of the issue of scale. And this is in the 1870s, very early critique of socialism. If you have 1,000 or 1,000,000 people, the vote or impact by voting of one person is minuscule. There's interesting questions about why we vote at all when in large-scale democracies, but certainly on day-to-day decisions over running the economy, the individual in a large-scale community will have very little power, and that creates an incentive problem to collaborate with others, an incentive problem to take account of all the complexities in decision making that are involved, and so on, all those things. And that's beautifully illustrated by a sequence of events in China. Scheffler, of course, is long gone, but the way in which China began a market economy, which happened shortly after the death of Mao died in 1976, And then Deng Xiaoping and a group, after a power struggle about 2 years, gained power. And then immediately from the bottom, a group of peasants uh, um, vowed or resolved to get rid of the collective farming system and to move from a system from that to large collectives, several thousand people, to a family-based system where if a family worked hard, they would reap the rewards of the extra work they did. So the incentives became manageable and meaningful in much smaller groups. And that led to a huge increase in agricultural productivity and the growth of a market economy in China. As you know, the rest is history. So it's a very important historical illustration of the incentive problem, which I attribute in part to Scheffler. The knowledge problem, which Hayek is particularly famous for, is also very important. I also want to highlight Michael Polanyi on the left here, who also said a lot about that. And he said some things which Hayek didn't develop so much. But both his authors, in different ways, different examples, emphasize the way in which knowledge is complex and irretrievably devolved. The term tacit knowledge comes from Polanyi on the left, Michael Polanyi. And tacit knowledge is knowledge we have in our heads, we can do. Like I'm speaking now in English and using rules of grammar, I hope so, but I can't articulate all those rules of grammar. That I'm not an English specialist, but I'm using rules that I can't articulate. And there's a lot of things like that, like riding a bicycle, things we can't articulate how to do, but we know how to do. And Hayek adopted this term tacit knowledge and emphasized it alongside Polanyi. And this is very, very important. I think the way knowledge is distributed and the way that large-scale systems have to manage knowledge and the epistemic problems and the role of institutions as epistemic organizations is also important. And this is well discussed by Hayek and others and also relevant. So how do people, these arguments I think are very compelling. I've just skimmed over the surface. How do people react to this? Well, I've still got some old left-wing friends who think I've sold out, by the way, by becoming a liberal social democrat. But nevertheless, a lot of them say, well, look, you're quoting all these cases from the past, Geoff. It wasn't really socialism. Real socialism has not been tried. Well, I mean, before I give a sensible argument in response to that, I'll show you a cartoon. This is like the in Cambodia. That wasn't real socialism, and there's the response. Yes, basically, it's a very satirical and crude rebuttal. The thing is, it was tried, and even though the situations in Russia in 1917, 1918 were very different from Venezuela a few years ago and now, similar problems occurred. The difficulties of planning, the impossibility of gathering all knowledge together, the question of incentives, the dangers of over-concentrating economic and political power, all those are present. And so therefore, I do think that the original socialists made mistakes, and we can't avoid those mistakes, even if we try again, even if we have a hope that things will be different. We have to learn from history. We've got 200 years history now of this, and we have to learn from it. So another argument is that people say, well, look what's wrong with capitalism. Capitalism is exploitative, and capitalism nurtured slavery and still does in some parts of the world. That's all true. Capitalism creates inequality. That's true as well. But it's rather unfair to compare an idealized socialism that never existed, which is somehow rid of all the defects of real socialism, with real capitalism. So why can't we have an idealized model of capitalism and say, let's assume away all the defects? We shouldn't, but we have to be fair. The comparison has to be between real and real, or imaginary. We can't cross over. It's that's unfair. So, is a humane socialism feasible? My argument is we've got enough evidence, both empirical and theoretical, to say no, socialism may be feasible, but not on sufficiently humane grounds. That's basically the argument in my Is Socialism Feasible book. I'm skipped over millions of details, but I welcome questions on that. So there's a danger on relying on imaginary socialist solutions, which are simply presumed to work next time, despite the failure of every previous such experiment. So now I introduce the second book, which is From Marx to Markets. And it's about the evolution of my own thinking on several of the points I've made and more. I did some dates. So I was born in 1946. My father was in the armed forces, in the air forces. I didn't know it then, but subsequent research makes it obvious that at that time, particularly in Europe, particularly in the UK as well, the Soviet Union was very popular. It was an ally. It helped to defeat fascism in Europe. My whole family was socialist, and my father was briefly a member of the Communist Party, and so was my grandfather. One of my grandfathers. So the whole family was socialist. We just brought up in this idea of a rational, better ordered, less competitive, less greedy society where we were kind to each other and fair to each other. Great thinking. And I retain some of that sentiment, but I don't think it's feasible in the way that socialists have argued. Another set of events. So I was on the left. I was originally a Labour Party member. I shifted over to Marxism, largely about 1967. So I was at Kent University in 65 in Manchester, and I was studying mathematics, and I shifted to mathematics and philosophy, then to economics later. 67, largely because of events and largely because of the way I was thinking and others, influenced by others. I became a Marxist, but I was always critical of the USSR and China, which created a problem for me. So I had to be some kind of Trotskyist, and then I didn't like the Trotskyists and so on, but that's a long story. It didn't take that long. It seemed a long time at the time, but by the second half of the 70s, I became interested in mixed socialist economies that use markets. I'd finished my first degree, and I'd studying economics more and more. One person that influenced me particularly, Hayek was a bit later, but was János Kornai, a Hungarian economist brilliant guy who I got to know quite well before he died recently. And he had this argument about mixed economies in his work. And I was trying to develop conceptions of how you could reconcile planning, some kind of planning, not complete planning because that's impossible, but some kind of planning and welfare states and so on, with a vibrant private sector, with markets which would enable innovation and so on. But from about 1980, I abandoned Marxism for several reasons. I'm still very much influenced by Marx and I admire Marx in very many ways, but I would not call myself a Marxist after about 1980. And normally, in political terms, I would call myself a social democratic liberal, of which there's many inside the Labour Party then and still. But for other reasons, I later moved out of the Labour Party. I was in the Labour Party in the 60s and 1974 to 2001. And I eventually, despite the reforming attempts at Blair, who was also critical for different reasons, I thought the Labour Party would not reform. And that view is still with me. I think the Labour Party finds it very difficult to modernise its views in a constructive way. And I joined the Liberal Democrats, particularly over the Brexit issue. I was very much opposed to Brexit, but also for other reasons, because I was more genuinely a liberal and less a socialist. There we go. So that's the story. If you want to ask any questions about it, I'll try and answer them. So my final message is we need to learn from the best variants within actually existing capitalism. Brian and I were talking about that earlier, about the importance of recognizing varieties of capitalism and extreme market advocates and extreme Marxists and socialists tend to minimize the varieties of capitalism, even though they take different sides of the debate. And I think we need to look at countries like the Nordic countries. The second half of my book is Socialism Feasible, looks at the Nordic countries as not as socialist, but as effective examples of social democratic welfare states, likewise in liberal solidarity. This book, obviously, from its title, Conceptualizing Capitalism, is about what we mean by capitalism. But all those books recognize the varieties of capitalism, which is an important issue that I don't think should go away. So I'm just about my time. I welcome your questions and the discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for the great presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, the audience members, feel free to now type your questions in the Q&A function. I will begin to select them and post them to our speaker, Geoff. But before I do that, I'll give all of you some time to create the questions. I'm just going to go first with my own questions, Geoff. I've been looking forward to this. So I'm in broad agreement with everything that you said, but I just want to play the devil's advocate for a bit. As you know, there are different sorts of Marxists. And somewhere I think in the 90s onwards, there is a bunch of Marxists, they call themselves the analytic Marxists. Okay, analytical Marxism. So these will include people, for example, like John Elster, John Romer, to some extent, I guess, Jerry Cohen. And these Marxists, they reject the traditional approach to argumentation where they don't use like labor theory of value. They try to make their arguments compatible with mainstream economics and social science. They replace arguments of class struggles and like Hegelian dialectics with even game theory, methodological individualism, incentives, and all that. So I guess because of that, they are not trying to smash markets, but trying to tame it. But then again, these people are still Marxists, right? So my understanding is that they have some sort of middle ground, where they want to keep some markets in like products, but capital markets, perhaps to varying degrees, are resisted, right? Um, and some of them would say, we want to have lots of public ownership of the means of production, and the heavy use of like worker cooperatives and like alternative forms of governance, right? So they still want to achieve, the goal of Marxism, but in a sense, it's like socialism and what we understand it, but it's a much more maybe gradual approach to that eventual aim. And of course, the sort of concepts and tenets they use are quite different, right? So is that big socialism? Is that small socialism? And what are your thoughts on this particular bunch?
Okay, that's a great question, Brian. I first come across, I didn't know all the names you mentioned personally, but I met Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis in the 70s in the US, and I kept up. I've been in contact with them both. Herb Gintis died a year or so ago, but sadly, they're different from people like Jerry Cohen. Jerry Cohen, I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he was writing as a Marxist, a sort of, and some of the stuff's very interesting. His defense of historical materialism is wrong, but very interesting. But Herb Gintis and Sam Bowles abandoned that goal. They no longer they supported a mixed economy, very much like I do. With worker cooperatives like I do, and under the planning and welfare and so on. So that group, and there's others like Jon Elster and what was his name? The come to me in a minute. Who actually at the beginning they all converged on this point, including Sam and Herb. And they all said we want to use rational choice, neoclassical theory, as you've mentioned, to make Marxism more rigorous. But politically, Herb and Sam went in a different direction. The others stuck to their guns on that. There's less rational choice stuff in Cohen's work, but there isn't Roma and Elster, let's say the name was conjoined to written on Roma. And I disliked that embrace of neoclassical theory right from the beginning when I met them. And it's what happened in the late 70s. And by that time, I got very influenced with people like Herbert Simon and Shackle and so on. All this is recounted in the book. And I thought neoclassical theory was powerful but limited. And I agree with Hayek. I see Hayek as another critic of neoclassical theory. And consequently, I don't think Roma and Elster ever learned the lesson of Hayekian critiques of socialism. So what they were proposing really skirted around the knowledge problem. And they write very intelligently and argue very well, but I don't think they really took on board the Hayekian critique. And I don't think what they're proposing is realistic. And they've had a number of interesting proposals. And I don't think it's a feasible midway solution either. Um, um, so, so analytical Marxism or rational choice Marxism, I think, is a different set of things. And insofar as it's based on neoclassical theory, I would accept a Hayekian critique of that, along with others like Simon and so on. Neoclassical theory, basically, the problem is it assumes low or negligible levels of uncertainty. It assumes that knowledge is mostly eventually accessible through the operation of markets and so on. Hayek didn't say that, and I didn't believe that. He believed that knowledge is inevitably always disturbs the first, always uncertain, and therefore I think I would criticize both the political conclusion and the analytical approach of analytical Marxists.
Great, Geoff. So just to clarify your answer a little bit, so of course I'm in agreement with you on the methodological problems of the neoclassical model, but let's put that aside for a while and focus on the political conclusion about the role of the state that they have. It seems to me that the main issue here is on scale, right? And even in your argument, the difference is on whether or not the attempt to engage in socialism or some sort of a communal system is widespread, is totalizing across society, or do you leave pockets of space for people to experiment, right? So I guess what you're saying here is that the analytical Marxists, even though they have this different toolkit, they still believe in widespread, right?
Yeah,
Widespread public ownership
yeah,
that doesn't leave enough space for private
yeah,
action
yeah.
and experimentation. And I guess that is that the root of the issue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One way of putting it, I mean, is to see a bifurcation that occurs early in the 19th century after the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment period is mainly the 18th century, high point of Enlightenment thinking in the French Revolution, of course, and lots of lessons learned from that. And then in the early 1800s, we have these two movements emerging, both of which are inspired by the Enlightenment. And one is socialism, and the other one is liberalism. Okay, liberalism forms, and the label is used quite early on in the 1800s. Helena Rosenberg has written an excellent book on that history. Now, the fundamental difference here is that socialists believe the problem is competition, and competition creates disharmony. And with the rational thought, the rational way of thinking that some Enlightenment thinkers pursued, we can deal with these problems simply by reason. Okay. My example of the work of cooperative shows that reason on its own won't work. Actually, there are constant arguments about what the rules were in the ONI communities. The religious communities solved that problem by adopting religious diktat, rules, and so on. So that's the first thing. The liberalism starts from an entirely different premise. It says there's always going to be different. There's always going to be conflict of ideas. There's always people with different interests. There's always going to be, even in a relatively equal society, even in Scandinavia, you still have differences of opinion. You still have some people who misbehave and other people who need help and so on, all sorts of things like that. Liberalism starts with that problem and says we cannot wave a magic wand called reason and solve it that way. So the whole of liberalism is attempts by various people, different versions, to deal with that. And that means devolution of power, it means separation of power, It means different centers of power. It means not concentrating all power in the center, not making everything rule over. Making rules, yes. Hayek and others will also say you need general rules, but make them sufficiently general and flexible so that you can accommodate difference within it. And it's that recognition of difference, which I think is absolutely crucial. And there always will be differences of view, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're going to have some people which are very difficult to handle. We're going to have people like Donald Trump that make a mess of everything, and we need to somehow, think of an alternative. But uh, there's differences of different degrees of danger, but they're always going to be there. And that's the fundamental difference, I think.
Great. All right. So let me now get into the audience questions. The first is by Maxim, who asks, do you think new technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence, can solve the difficulties in implementing socialism you presented? So
Yeah,
we
well, that's great.
got techno-socialism nowadays, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, before AI came along, I don't want to minimize its importance. It's very important. You had these arguments about the use of computers. Okay, so when the socialist calculation debate, I guess most people have heard of the social calculation debate, started in 1920, sometime after Scheffler, who was in the 19th century. But in the 1920, von Mises, Ludwig von Mises, made his famous critique essay of the possibility of socialism and argued with the experience of the Soviet Union present at that time, again, the difficulty of doing socialism basically was the problem of meaningful price calculation. And that created a debate through the 20s and 30s, of which Hayek was involved, and amplifying von Mises' arguments, but also a group of people who adopted mainstream economic theory, arguing that general equilibrium theory can demonstrate how socialism works. And you can have an auctioneer, the Oscar Langer model, and so on, mimicking markets and not having true markets, but replicating the processes in markets so that you can get some meaningful price. Now, there's huge numbers of problems in that. I mean, in terms of incentives, how you structure it, what the institutions are, and they don't answer those questions. But one problem is the sheer amount of information. There's a British economist called Alec Knowles, who wrote a book in 1980, published in 1983, called I think it was called "Is Socialism Feasible?" or something like that. No, it wasn't. It wasn't that. Forgot the exact title. It's not the same as mine. Anyway, he was a Soviet Union expert, and he says that the number of products, even a relatively economy which hasn't got the sophistication of Western economies, it goes into the millions, and gathering all the information together will be very difficult. And people responded by saying, let's use computers. Okay, we can shove all this in computers. So that debate goes on, and I participated in that debate through the 80s and 90s. The basic problem is you can't get all the information in. And this is again Hayek and Polanyi again, Michael Polanyi, Frederic Hayek. Much knowledge is tacit, and much skill is tacit. So you can't gather all that information because the people using it don't know exactly what it is. We don't all know the rules of the language we're speaking, and so on. There's many good examples of that if you'd like to read up more about it, but that's the basic problem. So, and the amount of time taken to do it. Now, could AI do that? No, I don't. I don't think the AI could easily extract from my head what I know about riding a bicycle. Now, I have difficulty to vocalize what I do. And if I wanted to teach you to ride a bicycle, the only way I could do it is to say, have you got a bike? Let's borrow a bike, and you sit on it, and then try pedaling and see what go wrong, and I'll tell you what to do when it goes wrong, and then remember how to steer and use your weight and so do that in practice. You learn by practice, right? I don't think AI can do that. AI is a very, very powerful tool. I'm using it myself more and more, but not to write stuff. I don't plagiarize, but to actually get some to search the web for insight and to evaluate things in certain ways. No, we can't rely on computers to do this because it's far too complex, and we need multiple institutions to process it. I mean, it's not just the market that works. This is a big difference between Hayek and Polanyi. Michael Polanyi saw science as a mechanism for dealing with knowledge, and the structures are quite different from those for the market. Hayek, of course, emphasized the market. Well, it wasn't wrong to give it emphasis, but there's other institutions, like institutions of science, which matter. And I would say that democracy is another institution, and we're seeing problems and flaws with the democratic system. And it requires a lot of learning, and we can use AI to help, but it's basically something that we've got to sort out.
Great. So next question from anonymous attendee. Given every system has issues, then choosing which one then is a question of trade-offs. How do we make that trade-off? Which philosophy framework should we use? If it's a subjective choice of value system, then it means it's not necessarily a right or wrong option. So I guess the question seems to be what is the normative criteria here that you use or that you think should be used in institutional evaluation?
Yeah, that's a great question too. There's a debate within liberalism. I'll find myself to that first about the meaning of liberty and the meaning of freedom, and that was another issue which divided Polanyi and Hayek, because Hayek and Friedman, Milton Friedman, of course, promoted the idea that basically liberty means the absence of coercion or the absence of constraint, which of course never actually happens, but we have to minimize those things so that as much as possible people are free. And Polanyi had a different view, which is not modern. It was there at the beginning of liberalism with Wilhelm von Humboldt and others like that, that liberty isn't simply about lack of constraint in a Hobbesian sense. It is also about developmental possibilities. If you like, you can use the slogan equality of opportunity then, and we need equal opportunities to develop ourselves. Now, the problem then is you get, who decides what those opportunities should be, who decides how to guide people and offer them different things. And a kind of Chicago libertarian would say, no, we're not going there. Let's stick to the Hayek-Friedman definition. I think the thing is more complex and wider. I'm with Polanyi rather than Hayek on that point. And so we need a notion of how to obtain human flourishing. And human flourishing is both giving individuals autonomy, reasonable amounts of autonomy, as much autonomy as possible, while they don't do harm to others, at the same time making society better for everyone, and which means health provision, education provision, and so on. And it's not simply a matter of individual choice; it's also a collective choice. So it's that very complicated agenda trying to deal with that, with the aim of human flourishing, of allowing people, giving people the opportunity to develop themselves as much as possible in fruitful, helpful directions.
So I think that leads us to the next question pretty well. Anonymous attendee asks, it seems you adopted a realistic approach in how we should improve social equality, which leads to your argument of we should work with the current capitalist system, as this is more fitting to how society actually operates. Similarly, democratic systems are not a system suited for every country. This is not to denounce democratic elements. So for a country like China, within which a non-democratic system may work pretty well for social welfare. Does it mean then we should work within the system or with the system rather than trying to change it into a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of dimensions in which we can think about change. And one is the economic mix between public and private sector, degree of state involvement, and so on. The other one is the democratic element. And I think the answer to these are different in different cases. So I'll come to China last. I think the question of equality, for example, by which we mean not just equality under the law, but also economic equality. That's equality of rough equality of income or reasonable minimization of the spread of income and likewise avoiding extremes in the distribution of wealth. Okay, there's political arguments for the latter, of course, because the concentration of oligarchic power is being currently exhibited in Trump's America. And a lot of people are pointing to the growth of inequality of wealth as being a major cause of that. And Thomas Piketty, of course, identified that issue as well some years ago. And that's important. Now, I think if we talk about the varieties of capitalism issue, then we can see by comparing different countries that we have very, very different outcomes. The US is relatively unequal, but extremely so by some measures in terms of wealth and income. My country is towards the end, the UK, but not so extreme as the United States. There's other extreme cases like Brazil, less developed, but nevertheless. And then on the other hand, we have the social democratic countries like Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, and so on, which are much more equal. No, not actually equal. I don't want exact equality, but much less spread over income, but less success in equalizing wealth distribution. Here, a starring example is Japan, which, because of land reforms since the Meiji Restoration, actually reduced asset spreads of inequality, which Piketty sees as the major mechanism. Now, turning to China, I think it's too soon to say to China, no, you must introduce democracy and so on. But there are problems down the road for China as it's going into the middle incomes now. Its GDP per capita in market in current terms, not PPP terms, in nominal terms, is about 35% of the US, around about that. And it's a middle income range country, so it develops hugely. And that shows what can be done without democracy, at least in the early levels. But every other country is successfully developed, including Japan, South Korea, and so on, and moved from that range, that low to middle range of GDP to higher levels, has democratized. So I would question on the basis of that experience whether China can catch up in terms of GDP per capita with the more developed countries in Europe and North America without democratizing to some degree. Why is that important? It's because it's important vis-a-vis the rule of law. And China has reintroduced a legal system since the death of Mao, and it works in some ways quite well. It's not defunct, but it has problems because the legal system is ultimately governed by the party state. The party state, one party system means they can interfere in decisions. And apart from human rights and other issues which are relevant here, commercially and economically, that's also important. That's why this lack of a legal space and legal autonomy, effective legal autonomy, is one reason why China has relatively few large corporations registered in mainland China. Most of the big ones were registered in Taiwan, which of course is not yet China again. It's a dispute over that. Hong Kong, which of course has become part of China, Macau, and so on. A lot of the countries, or elsewhere, a lot of the big names in Chinese companies are either state-owned or registered somewhere else. So to encourage large-scale corporations in China, I think you have to reform the legal and political system. And that's easy said and difficult to do, and a huge challenge for the Chinese authorities to do that. But I don't think it will catch up unless it starts on the road with those kind of reforms.
Great. Okay. So I think I will jump to the last pair of questions. But before that, just to answer Diana's question of the slides. So this video is going to be uploaded on YouTube. So you'll be able to review Geoff's presentation then in a very careful way. Okay. So I think let me just jump to two questions which are rather similar. And then I'll speak both at the same time, Geoff. So I think James asked the question, what do you take to be the modus operandi of modern populism? in the context of a resurgence of liberal thinking, which is more or less aligned with conservative thought, but emphasizes different principles. Does socialism pose a viable threat to populism? Should we favor socialism to populism to fascism? And in the same vein of thought, a question by Camille, who asked about Donald Trump. So it's about populism, Trump. As Trump was mentioned, it seems that a radically new visions emerging with Trump, suggesting a form of Caesarism capitalism, sowing chaos and based on permanent uncertainty, weakening the state of democracy, even in Europe. Could socialism face the power problem that dominates the current global economy? Are European institutions sufficiently strong enough to react against the libertarian market call from the US?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great set of questions, really highly pertinent. Let's talk about populism first. I think there's many definitions of populism and there's many features to it. And I will actually say there is a left populism and there is a right populism. And what we're familiar with in the form of Donald Trump and his followers, and also in my country with Nigel Farage and in Hungary with Orban and all these people, is a nationalistic right-wing populism. And that typically has an agenda of scapegoating ethnic minorities, hostility to immigrants, and that kind of thing, which is not necessarily shared by other populism. So, what is the ingredient that is shared? The ingredient that is shared is to look at a very, very complex world, which is very, very difficult to understand, and say that you've got a simple solution. And to promote the simple solution. I mean, this happens in my country with Farage. He says Brexit will solve all the problems. What happens? The opposite happens. He says food prices will go down, they go up. So they don't, so they think of some excuse. And Trump is doing the same. He hasn't got Brexit, but he's ill thought out solutions like heavy, very heavy tariffs, disrupting global trade, and then saying, oh, well, I must starting to retreat. Because he has a simplistic idea of how that particular recipe or policy will work, and when it's tried, it leads to disaster, which has a danger in authoritarianism. So it's a failure of populism that often leads to authoritarianism. So nascent fascist groups in Europe, like Mussolini in the 1920s, they too had simple solutions, simple slogans. But they dealt with the problem of failure of or incomplete success by violence and repression and ending democracy. And so that's the big, big danger. I mean, I don't like reading the papers today because every day you get something new that Trump's got up to. And it's not good news. It's not comfortable news, at least for me. The problem there is it's very, very new. If I'd said to you 30, I wouldn't have said it. I'm not so insightful to say this, but if we've got a time machine and I went back to 1970 and said to people there in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party that in 50 years or so, you'll get a president that aligns himself not with the West, but with Russia, who doesn't believe in free markets, so he dismantles the world trade system, but breaks up NATO and all these things. Nobody would believe me. And quite rightly, they were very skeptical. I mean, it's unbelievable what Trump is doing. So we live in a very dangerous time. So we have some kind of precedence. I mean, people are describing Trump as a fascist, and there are strong similarities between Trump and fascism. But if it is fascism, it's a unique variant, and I'm not against calling it that because it is repressive, potentially repressive and dangerous, and against civil liberties. Now, libertarianism, the traditional American liberal libertarian right, I can't see any one of those but seriously backing Trump. Okay, I mean there may be cases, but the ones I know personally don't back Trump. They're anti-terrorist, for example, and they would not be sympathetic to Russia either. But in some ways, I would argue they've paved the way for Trump. And they paved the way because you had a succession of governments in the US which have refused to deal with the problem of increasing inequality, economic inequality. And so America, as Piketty's data show, there's this huge increase in the Gini coefficient and the adverse data on the distribution of wealth as well. And that creates this powerful oligarchic class, which can, as Elon Musk has done and does, he's got money to buy elections, to flood the media with, in any country, social media, break laws over election expenses. We still have in my country. They're in the dustbin in America. But all these things distort democracy. Misguiding images on information, fake news, all these tricks that Russians have developed over the years, they're being used. That is not very liberal, it's not very libertarian. And I would say I would like to, be interested to find any libertarian that's defending this stuff. So I'm sympathetic to the views of libertarians about liberty. And liberty, for me, we share the view that liberty is important. And where we differ is that I think welfare states are possible with rather high levels of taxation to sustain them without destroying freedom, without destroying human development, and without adversely affecting humans and people's rights. And that's maybe a difficult line to draw, and to follow. But nevertheless, I think that's possible. That's a debate I would have with libertarians.
Great. So we've now come to the end of this very stimulating and fruitful session with Professor Geoff Hodgson. So, Geoff, thank you very much for your time. That was a fantastic presentation. So I encourage all of you to check out our previous webinars. I've put the YouTube link in the chat there. And also I encourage you to check out our future events. We have 2 live events also streamed online in May next month. So please check that out in the link I've dropped here. So do check out Professor Hodgson's books, which I will put in the YouTube video description when this video is uploaded in the next 1 week. So thank you very much, Geoff, once
Thank
again,
you
and
very
all
much, Brian.
for taking the
Thank
time.
you, everyone.
Thank you.